Chapter 9. Patience. A big ceiling fan rotated slowly above us, with a steady, rhythmic creak. It was May 1950, and it was hot in Khartoum. The fan stirred the warm air in the large bare office where we sat. Faded green louvered shutters were closed over the large open windows, allowing air to enter, but excluding the glaring sunlight and searing heat. At one end of the office stood a big brown wooden desk, with big brown wooden in and out trays. At the desk opposite us, dressed in tropical khaki, sat Squadron Leader McCall, the Sudan government Civil Secretary for Air, reading a document we had given him. Behind him hung a portrait of King George VI, while the wall facing the windows displayed a large, detailed map of the Sudan. Jack and I had brought in our survey report, and with it, our request to start an air service for missions in the south. We were awaiting his reactions and praying silently. McCall looked up. "I see Governor John Winder of the Upper Nile province has been helpful and positive regarding your survey this past month," he commented. This seemed a promising start, especially as he went on, "I see no great problems in your proposals." But then came the bombshell. "One major requirement will be that you always fly with a qualified and licensed wireless telegraphy operator, able to transmit and receive messages in Morse code. It's essential that you keep in touch with our air traffic control system so that we can always know your takeoffs, your position, and your landings." One of our crew would have to obtain a WT operator's license, for which a speed of 20 words a minute would be required. If issued to us, it would be the first flight WT radio operator's license ever given by the Sudan government. At that time, there was no long-range radio telephone, RT, for voice communication in air traffic reporting in Sudan. It all had to be done in Morse code. My Morse speed at that stage, learned in the Cardiff University Air Squadron 10 years before, was about 8 words a minute, far short of the international standard. We were surprised and shaken by this new demand. It would take me some months to reach the speed required, a serious delay in starting any regular flying, but it couldn't be avoided. McCall was speaking again. "The other thing is that your whole proposal for an air operation in the south will need to be considered and agreed by the political department. This will take time." That was the beginning of a new series of challenges. To meet the first, I immediately started to study Morse to reach the standard demanded. My father had been one of the first members of the newly formed Royal Corps of Signals in World War I. He could read Morse at high speed, even automatic Morse. Always a keen radio enthusiast, he picked up messages from all over the world. As a child, I had watched him do this with fascinated admiration. He told me of amazing operators who could send out Morse messages at high speed while receiving and writing down equally rapid incoming messages at the same time. That legendary ideal I never attained. Learning Morse in the heat of Sudan proved demanding. For part of the time I was helped by a Sudanese official from the Khartoum Post and Telegraph offices. Effendi Yusuf Banyuti, an Egyptian, would come and give me an hour's instruction each afternoon, after which I had to put in a lot of hard and hot practice on my own. I shared a room at the headquarters of the Sudan Interior Mission in Khartoum with 2 other men, Bill Rogers and Dr. Lionel Gurney. At that point, each of us had a different task. Mine was to learn Morse as quickly as I could. Bill's was to learn Arabic. Dr. Lionel's was to discover whether God wanted him to set up Christian medical work along the Red Sea coast. There were days when all 3 of us were working away in the room together. In one corner, I would be making a buzzer sing out Morse messages in a continuous rhythm. In another corner, Bill would be poring over his books, muttering away in Arabic. In the centre, Dr. Lionel would be kneeling beside one of the iron bedsteads, lost in silent prayer. In later years, Dr. Lionel founded the Red Sea Mission Team. Bill pioneered work in southern Sudan and later went to Nigeria. I became involved in a lifetime's work with MAF. Whilst I was concentrating on meeting one challenge, others were building up. "We are seriously in debt," wrote a worried Dr. Cochrane to us in Khartoum. "We already have an overdraft of £3,000 with the bank." Then came another blow. Jack and Helen had to return to the UK. Although an experienced and professional RAF pilot, Jack had been unable to obtain a civil commercial pilot's license because of a very slight defect in his sight. Our policy in MAF was to operate only to full commercial standards in both flying and maintenance, even though we were not going to be flying for profit. The lack of a commercial license ruled Jack out as a longer-term pilot with MAF. Dr. Cochrane had made it clear that with a rapidly increasing bank overdraft, Mildmay could not pay Jack and Helen's passage home, nor could they pay a pilot to replace him. Nor, worst of all, had they even the funds to support the ongoing work of MAF in the Sudan. We believed the problems would be overcome. Jack was prepared to pay for the passages home himself. As for the costs of continuing to stay in the Sudan, we were still sure God had called us there and convinced He would provide for us. Our position on financing future operations was based on three main principles. First, the cost of providing the plane had already been covered, and we'd continue to subsidize the operating overheads, such as insurance, operating fees, and administration, as far as we could. Second, we would make a minimum charge for running costs, including fuel and spares. Third, we would each find our own living expenses and personal financial support. This was similar to the policy followed by MAF US. It meant that MAF services had a basic financial viability. Any new funds could be used to purchase further aircraft and subsidize or expand the work. We felt that this was a wise, God-given policy. It certainly proved effective through many subsequent years. I was more than sorry to part with Jack and Helen when, late in July, they went home, leaving me very much on my own. We knew a replacement pilot would soon be available, but didn't know when he'd be able to arrive. The last crisis of this series was yet to come. Mildmay sent word that they were unable to pay Murray Kendon's return passage to England. He decided to stay in New Zealand, so was no longer available to represent MAF in the UK. I had hoped that Jack Hemmings, with all his experience and ability, would stay in the work, but that was not to be. Another ex-RAF man, Bill Knights, who had come in to administer the office while Jack, Murray and I were away, was able to continue for a further couple of years. Mildmay certainly could not afford anyone extra, so Jack returned to his pre-war profession of accounting. I was left to negotiate with the Sudan government our proposals for an air service for missions. Further stories of missionaries' travel needs and hardships continued to reach me. While I was still waiting for the government's response, requests for the plane kept coming in. Humanly speaking, things were hardly hopeful. Jack had gone, we were short of funds, and I hadn't yet attained the necessary speed in Morse. Strangely, I don't remember being discouraged. God promises to provide all our needs, and there was friendship, encouragement, and fellowship at the mission headquarters, there in Khartoum. God must have given me the necessary measure of faith. Looking back, I am amazed at how much he must have given. I continue to see the real need and purpose of MAF in the Sudan. If God was with us, who could be against us? "Stuart, I've got some news for you." It was the SIM treasurer in her little Khartoum office. "I've been given the money to pay the customs duty on the spares that have arrived for the Rapide." She was not allowed to tell me who had provided it. That was just one of many encouragements. 2 other gifts came from SIM missionaries, this at a time when they were not receiving even their own very small salaries in full. There were some other anonymous gifts. The love and practical help that came from the very people we were seeking to serve was heartening. God was good. God was faithful. Then came even greater encouragement. The new MAF pilot was ready. He was Steve Stevens, an officer in the South African Air Force, who'd won the DFC flying twin-engined Beaufighters over the Balkans in World War II. Later, he'd flown many transport flights, ferrying military staff from Cairo to South Africa. He knew Africa well. Khartoum had been one of his staging posts. Posted there for a short time in 1947 as an Air Force liaison officer, he'd made contact with the SIM and learned of the great isolation of their southern stations and the need for a mission plane. He realized then why he'd been brought to Khartoum. God was preparing him to fly that plane. Soon after this, Steve heard of MAF and wrote to the office at Mildmay. His letter came at the time of our preparations for the Central Africa Gemini survey. Murray Kendon had promptly replied, telling him of the plans, telling him too that Sudan would be considered in the future. Now that future had arrived, and Steve got ready to leave the Air Force and come to Sudan. He wrote, saying that he would be able to support himself and his family from his Air Force savings, at least until other support could be generated from Christian friends in South Africa. A little over a month after Jack and Helen had left, I was called in to see the political secretary. Mal Forsberg came with me. The meeting was at Gordon's Palace, built on the site where General Gordon died in 1885 while defending Khartoum against the attacking dervishes. We had come to the heart of the Sudan government. The political secretary had before him the file from the Civil Aviation Department containing our survey reports and application. "This is the first time we've had anything like this," was his opening remark. He added, "There's a great deal involved in trying to grant such a permission. Are we going to put you under the classification of traitors? You are going to be working in districts in the south that we classify as closed areas. We will need to think about granting you special permits for entry to these areas. Then we've got to ask ourselves, what effect will granting you a charter license have in the future? It will set a precedent. We are going to have to consider all these things very carefully." He went on to ask us how we were supported. I don't remember how I answered him on that, but somehow he seemed satisfied. God was on our side. "It will be 3 weeks before we can let you know our final decision," he warned, as we left. It was with some surprise that only 6 days later I received a letter from him. It said, "Your project has been approved." Steve had said he could come up in mid-September. I now wired saying, "Come." On 14th of September, he arrived from Johannesburg, leaving his wife Kay and their 3 daughters, with Colleen, just 1 month old, to follow later. In God's grace, he only had to pay half fare and was given a double baggage allowance. I was glad to see him. After all the years of preparation, after all the setbacks, our regular operations were about to begin.